Hi, this is Dan, and this is another video where I describe what a section of Hartford, Connecticut was like before it was transformed by urban renewal. One of the high-rises in downtown Hartford is the 26-story Gold Building. Erected in 1975, its official name is One Corporate Plaza, and it is located at 755 Main Street at the corner of Pearl Street. Located behind the Gold Building to the west along Pearl Street is a parking garage. In a previous video, I talked about the south side of Pearl Street, which is now the north side of the Gold Building complex. I'll link that video in the description below. In this video, I'm going to talk about lost buildings that once stood along what's now the Main Street side of the Gold Building, up to the corner of Pearl Street. At one time, this stretch was lined with numerous old buildings. They had fascinating connections to the city's long history, including the home where one of the city's oldest residents lived from the time he was 2 until he died just 2 days before his 97th birthday, the building that housed the city's second oldest continuously operating business from 1828 until 1964, and the venue where Mark Twain made his acting debut. This is a photograph of a parade on Main Street in Hartford around the year 1880. It shows the row of buildings on the west side of Main Street, south of Pearl Street. The oldest of these buildings at the time, located near where the southeast corner of the Gold Building is today, belonged to the Hosmer estate, which dated back to the late 18th century. This stereograph shows the Hosmer property in about the year 1859. On the left, just to the south, was the building which at the time housed Kellogg Brothers lithographers. I talked about this building in an earlier video, which I'll link in the description below. Next to it were the two buildings on the Hosmer estate itself. These were a 3-story brick commercial structure and a 2-story house. In this vicinity, as I mentioned in that earlier video, James Muckler, an Irish immigrant, had his barber shop in the 1760s and 70s. The Hartford Courant had its very first office above Muckler's shop in 1764. The property passed to Prosper Hosmer, husband of Catherine Muckler, in 1786. Prosper's brother James was a merchant tailor who had his home and business in the house pictured here on the right. The oldest section of the house, built in the late 18th century, was later moved back to become a rear L when this front section was built. The house was long the residence of James Hosmer's son, James Bidwell Hosmer, who was born in 1781 and who lived here from the time he was 2 until he died in 1878, just 2 days before his 97th birthday. The young James B. Hosmer opened a dry goods business. On the left is one of his advertisements from 1821. After he was burned out by a fire in the 1830s, Hosmer retired as a merchant and focused on banking and philanthropy. For many years, he served as president of Society for Savings, which was then popularly known as the Pratt Street Savings Bank. Among other positions, he was also treasurer of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, vice president of the American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, treasurer of the Connecticut Historical Society, trustee of the Watkinson Library, and a trustee of the Hartford Theological Seminary, which would have a building, Hosmer Hall, named in his honor. James's brother Charles, who had died in 1871, also had a successful career, first as a printer and newspaper publisher, and then as a merchant. In his later years, Charles lived with his brother James and widowed sister in the old family homestead. It seems that James B. Hosmer's dry goods store was located just north of the house, where the Sisson Drug Company building that I'll be talking about in a moment was later built. His brother Charles's store was located in the back of the Hosmer property. At the time of Charles Hosmer's death in 1871, the Hartford Times related that, quote, "It was nearly half a century ago that he opened the well-known business place opposite the present post office, and which for more than a generation was known as Hosmer's Toy Shop. It was a veritable old curiosity shop where not only all the latest Christmas toys, but endless quantities of quaint, ancient, and curious things could be found. That old shop was the wonder and delight of a generation of young folks in the days gone by. Next door north of it, Mr. H's brother, James B. Hosmer, had a stylish dry goods establishment. For 30 years before retiring from business, Charles Hosmer was the agent of the American Tract Society, and its Bibles and tracts and Sunday school books were distributed from the toy shop." Unquote. Charles Hosmer closed his shop in 1864, at which time the Times had reported, quote, "The old inhabitants can remember that when young he purchased toys of Charles Hosmer for the holidays. His store has been the variety shop of the town for the past and present generations. It was a variety store, and you might buy there almost anything, from a spyglass to a top or a gold epaulette to a boy's marble." Unquote. As I mentioned, Charles died in 1871. After his older brother, James B. Hosmer, died 7 years later, a reporter from the Hartford Courant visited the property and provided a detailed account of the old house and its antique contents, which were soon to be auctioned off. In the Courant of October 4th, 1878, he wrote of the house, quote, "The entrance on Main Street is by a door solidly constructed of planks, opening into the apartment occupied by Mr. Hosmer's father for business purposes. This door has never been changed. Its majestic bolts and old-fashioned latch remain as they were. The room is about 12 feet square, with a window on the south and another on the Main Street side, at which, during the later years of his life, Mr. Hosmer spent many hours, daily gazing upon the tide of humanity flowing along the thoroughfare. In this apartment Mr. Hosmer transacted all his business, and enterprises involving very large amounts have there been discussed and acted upon." Unquote. This is the Hosmer property depicted in the 1885 Sanborn Atlas of Hartford. After walking through the various rooms and describing their contents, the Hartford Courant reporter entered the rear yard, which had a dilapidated stable, an overgrown garden, several trees, and a well. The reporter continued, quote, "On the south side of the house the lot has an open space reaching back to the old cemetery. In the rear of the brick building, on this side, is the old store of Mr. Hosmer's brother Charles, a square, low-ceilinged room given to dust and cobwebs, and filled with a collection of time-worn furniture. On a mantelpiece is a framed sign, C. Hosmer Variety Store, number 138, the street number of the building during the occupant's lifetime. Venerable leather-covered account books are scattered everywhere, and fastened to the wall on the north side is shelving with labels showing that it had been used for the keeping of religious tracts for which Mr. Hosmer was agent in this city. The arrangement of these labels is exact, and by it any particular tract out of the hundreds that were apparently kept could readily have been found." Unquote. The Hosmer buildings survived another 8 years until they were demolished to make way for a large 5-story structure known as the Waverly Building, which would dominate the block. Completed in 1887, the Waverly was designed by the Hartford architect John C. Mead and had a facade of Philadelphia pressed brick with brownstone trimmings. It was built as an investment property by the Brown-Thompson department store. It had stores on the ground floor, and originally there were residential apartments above. This postcard dates to circa 1901, when Moss Brothers clothing store occupied 2/3 of the building's ground floor. The Waverly Building would survive for many decades, but it would lose its upper-level penthouse and rooftop balustrade around 1948. And of course, as we know, it would eventually be demolished in the early 1970s to make way for the Gold Building. This photograph must date to 1886 because the Waverly Building is just under construction on the far left. The next two buildings to the north also had storied connections to Hartford history. The first of these was the Sisson Drug Company building. The origins of this building, pictured here in about the year 1859, went back perhaps as far as the 1780s, when it was a smaller structure of just 2 floors. In 1828, the business that would become the Sisson Drug Company took over and expanded the building. The company would remain here until 1964. By that time, it was the oldest continuously operating drug company in Connecticut and the second oldest continuously operating business in Hartford after the Hartford Courant newspaper. The origins of the company went back to 1785 to the drug and grocery store of Asa Hopkins, which for a time was located further south on Main Street just north of the Old Stone Bridge. After Asa died in 1805, his brother Daniel continued the business, followed by Daniel's son, Daniel P. Hopkins. He was joined by partners William T. Lee and Albert W. Butler, and it was the firm of Lee, Hopkins, and Butler that completed this building in 1828. In the 1840s, after Hopkins retired and Thomas Sisson had joined the firm, it became known as Lee, Butler and Company, as reflected in the name at the top of the building. Butler died in 1858, so at the time of this photograph in 1859, it had become Lee, Sisson and Company. The sons of the original Lee and Butler also became partners, and the business's name was later Sisson, Butler and Company, then T. Sisson and Company. By the way, Sisson Avenue in Hartford is named for Thomas Sisson's brother, Albert Lee Sisson. In 1907, after Thomas Sisson's death, the Sisson Drug Company was incorporated as a joint stock company with George P. Chandler as president. In 1914, Chandler oversaw the remodeling of the original building with a new facade and an extension in the rear. For many years, under the stairs on the ground floor, the building still retained a huge fireplace where medicines had long been compounded. In 1922, Chandler was succeeded as president by his son, George A. Chandler. The company finally ended its long association with the building in 1964 when its successor, the Hartford Wholesale Drug Company, moved to Atlantic Avenue. For many years, the Sisson Drug Company was the distributor of Griswold's Family Salve, which was invented to treat skin irritations by Chauncey Griswold during the Revolutionary War. Sisson eventually acquired the recipe from Griswold's son-in-law, and continued to produce the salve until the mid-20th century, when it was taken off the market because it contained oleate of lead. The salve was known around the world. One day early in the 20th century, a visitor from Honolulu who had used it since he was a boy came to the Sisson building to see for himself where the famous salve was made. This is another photograph from about 1859. The Sisson building is on the left, and on the right is a building that had some interesting literary associations. In the 19th century, Hartford was a center of book publishing. One tenant of the building was William James Hammersley, a publisher and seller of books and stationery. As early as 1833, he printed a newspaper called the Independent Press. He also produced many school textbooks. Hammersley served as mayor of Hartford from 1853 to 1854, and again from 1862 to 1864. Another tenant of the building was the publishing firm of House and Brown. The building in which these publishers were located, which is on the left in this photograph, was erected in the 1830s. In addition to stores and offices, the four-story building contained a large public meeting hall called Gilman's Hall. Starting in 1839, this was the meeting place of the Young Men's Institute, a private association that provided a venue for lectures and debates. The Institute had a library and reading room, having merged with the Hartford Library Company, a subscription library first formed in 1774. In the 1840s, the Young Men's Institute moved to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and it would eventually evolve into the Hartford Public Library. In 1869, Gilman's Hall was renamed Good Templars Hall, and from 1876 to 1878 it was known as Dramatic Hall. On April 26th and 27th, 1876, Mark Twain made his debut upon the dramatic stage at Dramatic Hall in an amateur production of the play The Loan of a Lover. As the Current reported on April 25th, 1876, quote, "The sale of seats for the play The Loan of a Lover at Dramatic Hall tomorrow evening began at Hammersley and Company's yesterday, and the beginning was very near the end of the sale. Within half an hour every seat was taken. In view of this quick sale, which proves that the public interest in the play is very much greater than the size of the hall can measure by a single performance, the entertainment will be repeated on Thursday evening, and the sale of seats for the evening will begin at 9 o'clock this morning, but not until 9 at Hammersley's." Unquote. So how was Mark Twain's debut performance? On April 27, 1876, a reviewer in the Hartford Current wrote, quote, "It may safely be said that there has never been given in Hartford a more thoroughly satisfactory amateur entertainment than that last evening at the Dramatic Hall. It was in every way a success. To the majority of people at all familiar with private theatricals, The Loan of a Lover is a play well known and favorite, but not The Loan of a Lover that was given last night." The report that Mr. Clemens had rewritten the play was not correct, and yet not altogether wrong. He had, in fact, rewritten merely the part of Peter Speke, the Dutch farmer, whose obtuseness is an interesting feature of the original. But as thus amended and acted by Mr. Clemens, the fellow is not incidentally stupid. He is the model blockhead, irresistible in the comicalities that his stupidity leads him into, and wandering in the course of the vagaries incident to his dull mind through a series of mental processes that fairly convulse the audience without breaking up the continuity of the graceful play as it was originally written. This was Mr. Clemens's first appearance on the stage, but it was one to congratulate him heartily upon. The rest of the actors also did admirably. The music, broken as the play is by frequent songs, was a peculiar attraction, but of Mr. Clemens's fitness for the opera as well as for the unsung drama, this is perhaps not the place to speak." Unquote. The publisher William Webster Ellsworth, who was in the audience that night, wrote in his memoirs, quote, "He took the part of the gardener, Peter Speke, in The Loan of a Lover, and the lady I afterwards married was Gertrude. Unfortunately, I had no part in the play. Unfortunately is a word I can use looking back upon it now, but at the time, those of us who were not in The Loan of a Lover counted ourselves as fortunate, for our star developed early in the performance a propensity to go on with his talk after the other person's cue came. He would put in lines which, while very funny to those on the other side of the footlights, were decidedly embarrassing to his fellow actors. At one point, I remember he began to tell the audience about the tin roof, which he had just put on an L of his new house, and rambled on for a while, ending up that particular gag by asking Gertrude, very much to her embarrassment, if she had ever put a tin roof on her house." Unquote. At the end of 1878, the former Dramatic Hall became the armory of the Putnam Phalanx. This was a social patriotic organization named in honor of Israel Putnam that was first organized as a ceremonial honor guard in 1858. Members dressed in uniforms based on those of the Continental Army. This picture, taken on Battle Flag Day, September 17, 1879, shows the decorations on the Sisson building to the left and the building to the right that had become, by then, the Putnam Phalanx Armory. In the distance, behind the Sisson building, is the bell tower of the Hartford Fire Department, which was located behind the State Savings Bank on Pearl Street. The original bell placed in the tower in 1867 cracked in 1881, and it was sent to the Jones & Company foundry in Troy, New York, for recasting. When the new bell was brought to be placed in the tower, it was brought to the alley between these two buildings in a heavy truck. After a side of the lower floor of the tower was removed, the 8,175-pound bell was brought to the center of the tower floor and laboriously hoisted up by a team of a dozen men. The new bell remained in use until 1921 and is now on the grounds of the Connecticut Historical Society. The Putnam Phalanx Armory building had two stores on the first floor. Remember that the South store had once been home to Hammersley and Company. From 1870, the North store was rented by Krug Parrish and Company, tobacconists and cigar manufacturers. It became Krug Powers and Company in about 1885. This photo was taken in 1889. The store was much frequented by members of the fire department. In 1901, Michael Powers retired and Louis Krug continued the business until he had to sell it in 1903. That was because in that year, Krug was elected chief of the fire department and was not allowed to engage in a business while holding office. Krug remained fire chief until he retired in 1912 after he'd injured his leg responding to a fire the previous year. North of the Putnam Phalanx Armory was a building erected in about 1854 that for over half a century was home to a notable Hartford grocery store. In about 1877, J.P. Haynes and Company opened the Boston Branch Tea and Grocery House in the building's north store space. It was called the Boston Branch because Haynes had worked in the prominent grocery store of Cobb, Bates, and Yerxa in Boston. Other former clerks of that store who set up their own businesses in other cities would also use the name Boston Branch. In 1889, Weston W. Walker purchased the business from Haynes and soon announced the store's reopening after a 6-week modernization. Walker would soon double the store's size by expanding into the building's south store space. In 1900, the W. W. Walker Company was incorporated. In 1913, when leadership of the company passed to Walker's successor, Thomas G. Mills, the Current reviewed the business's growth. Quote, Boston branch was one of the first groceries to introduce a delicatessen department, and it was also one of the first stores in the city to have a bakery and candy kitchen, while it was a pioneer in making use of electric automobiles for delivery. Unquote. The Boston branch had grown from a small general store that only required 1 or 2 clerks into a large grocery with different departments and a restaurant on the second floor. By the late 1920s, it had a staff of over 130. In 1927, the Boston branch opened a store in West Hartford Center, but this was sold off 2 years later, and in 1930, the original Hartford store also closed its doors. The store's owner, Thomas G. Mills, then started a new venture, a restaurant in the Waverly Building called Mills Spa, but this was short-lived, going out of business in 1934. This is a view of the block now occupied by the Gold Building in the aftermath of the blizzard of 1888. On the left are the buildings I've talked about in this video already: the Waverly Building, the Sisson Building, the Putnam Phalanx Armory Building, and the building that was home to the Boston Branch Grocery, which in 1888 still occupied only half of the ground floor. Just to the north, there were 2 adjacent structures. The one at the corner of Main and Pearl Streets was erected in about 1847. This is another image from the 1888 blizzard, this time a view west down Pearl Street with the corner building on the left. From 1887 to 1913, one of its tenants was the Connecticut River Banking Company. This was Hartford's 3rd oldest bank, incorporated in 1825 to assist the recently formed Connecticut River Company in its mission to improve navigation on the Connecticut River north of Hartford and to construct a canal to bypass the rapids at Enfield Falls. The town of Windsor Locks is named for the series of locks on this canal. In 1913, the bank moved into new offices in the Travelers Building. In 1954, the bank would merge with the Hartford National Bank and Trust. The space the bank vacated at the corner of Main and Pearl Streets was taken over and remodeled by the Alderman Drug Company. As the Hartford Current reported, quote, the old floor, ceiling, walls, etc. must be torn out, including the vault. A new tile floor and metal ceiling, etc. are to be installed. The front will be changed over to give a corner entrance with an additional entrance on Pearl Street at about the place where the trolley cars stop. A new lighting and plumbing system will be put in. One of the latest Lippincott soda fountains, absolutely sanitary, of mahogany and green Italian marble, will be set up, in addition to other fixtures. Unquote. I'd like to finish this video by talking about the dramatic changes that affected the buildings north of the Waverly Building in the early 20th century, several decades before they were finally torn down to make way for the Gold Building. I already mentioned that the Sisson Drug Building's facade was altered in 1914. At some point, the facade of the former Putnam Phalanx Armory was also altered, with new designs around the windows on the 2nd and 3rd floors. The building went through an even more dramatic change in 1932 when its upper 2 stories were removed and it was given a modern facade. In 1933, the building next door that had once housed the Boston branch was demolished and replaced with a new 2-story building. The north half of the building was then extensively remodeled in 1938 to become the home of Salt's Clothiers and Jewelers. By the time of this photograph in the 1940s, the only buildings in the block north of the Waverly to maintain their 19th century appearance were the ones next to the corner of Pearl Street. By the time of the photo on the left in 1940, the corner store had been occupied by the Alderman Drug Company since 1913. In 1944, Alderman's was sold to the United Cigar Whelan Stores Corporation. It continued to operate as the Whelan Alderman Drug Store until the 2 corner buildings were torn down in 1948 and replaced with a new 2-story Whelan Drug Store building. This photograph is a view south down Main Street showing the 1949 Whelan Drug Store building at the corner of Pearl Street. North of the Sisson building, all of the 4-story structures had been replaced with 2-story ones. Of course, the most dramatic change of all came in the early 1970s, when the Gold Building arose, replacing everything from the old Waverly Building up to the intersection with Pearl Street. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, using the Super Thanks feature, and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.